At my daughter's wedding, her groom told me to sit in the back, so I stopped all the payments and did this. The morning of Claire's wedding, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, adjusting my tie for the 15th time. My hands were shaking, not from nerves about the ceremony, but from something deeper. Something I couldn't quite name yet. "You look handsome, Dad." Claire's voice drifted through my bedroom door. She'd stopped by my modest 2-bedroom apartment in Queens to pick up the pearl necklace that had belonged to her grandmother, my mother. The same necklace I'd sold my father's vintage Mustang to buy back from the pawn shop 3 years ago, though Claire never knew that part of the story. "Thanks, sweetheart," I called back, forcing brightness into my voice. "Ready for the big day?" But as I heard her heels clicking away down the hallway, that familiar knot twisted tighter in my stomach. For months, I'd been watching my daughter transform into someone I barely recognized. The Claire who used to spend Saturday mornings with me at the local diner, splitting pancakes and talking about her dreams of becoming a teacher, had been replaced by someone who spoke in hushed tones about social circles and making the right connections. All because of Andrew Mitchell. I'd first met Andrew 8 months ago at a small family dinner Claire had organized. He'd arrived 20 minutes late in a BMW that probably cost more than I made in 2 years, wearing a suit that screamed money. His handshake was firm, his smile practiced, and his eyes cold. They were the kind of eyes that sized you up in seconds and filed you away under irrelevant. "So, Mr. Peterson," he'd said that night, cutting into his steak with surgical precision, "Claire tells me you work in consulting." "That's right." I'd kept my answer simple, the way I always did. "What kind of consulting? Management? IT?" His tone suggested he was already bored by the conversation. "Business development, mostly. Small companies looking to expand." Andrew had nodded politely, but I caught the way his attention immediately shifted to Claire's Uncle Marcus, who worked as a financial advisor on Wall Street. For the rest of the evening, I might as well have been invisible. That should have been my first warning. Now, driving through the gates of the Grandview Manor, a sprawling estate in the Hamptons that looked like something out of a fairy tale, I felt that same invisibility creeping over me again. Valets in crisp white uniforms were directing a parade of luxury cars, Mercedes, Bentleys, even a few Ferraris. My 10-year-old Honda Civic looked like a lost puppy among thoroughbreds. The wedding hall itself took my breath away. Crystal chandeliers hung from a vaulted ceiling painted with cherubs and gold leaf. White roses and orchids cascaded from every surface, their perfume mixing with the scent of expensive cologne and champagne. Everything gleamed with the kind of polish that only serious money could buy. I'd seen places like this before, of course, but never as a guest. Usually, I was the guy in the background, making sure the right checks got written to the right people. "Excuse me, sir?" A young woman in a black dress appeared at my elbow, clipboard in hand. "Are you family of the bride or groom?" "Bride. I'm her father." Her eyes widened slightly, and she glanced down at her list. "Mr. Peterson? Oh. I'm so sorry, I didn't realize. Let me show you to your seat." She led me toward the front of the hall, where white silk ribbons marked off the first 3 rows on each side. The groom's side was already filling with people who looked like they'd stepped out of a Fortune 500 annual report. Designer dresses, Rolex watches, and the kind of confident posture that came from never having to check your bank balance before buying groceries. I was almost to the second row when a hand grabbed my arm. "Whoa there, partner." I turned to find Andrew standing behind me, resplendent in a tuxedo that probably cost more than my monthly rent. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his smile was magazine perfect, and his grip on my arm was just a little too tight. "Andrew." I managed to keep my voice steady. "Congratulations." "Thanks." He didn't let go of my arm. Instead, he glanced around quickly, then leaned in close. His cologne was overwhelming, something expensive and aggressive. "Listen, I hate to do this today of all days, but we've got a bit of a seating situation." "A situation?" "Yeah, see." He gestured toward the front rows with his free hand. "These seats up here, they're reserved for immediate family and, well, important guests. Major donors to my family's foundation, business partners, that sort of thing. People of status, you know? The word status hit me like a slap. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline that never came. So I was thinking. He continued, his smile never wavering. Maybe you'd be more comfortable toward the back. Nothing personal, you understand. It's just that appearances matter at these things, and my parents' friends, well, they expect a certain atmosphere. The hall suddenly felt 10 degrees colder. The sound of conversations and clinking glasses faded into a dull roar. I looked past Andrew to where his father, Richard Mitchell, was holding court near the altar, surrounded by men in expensive suits laughing at whatever joke he just told. Richard owned half the commercial real estate in Manhattan and had never missed an opportunity to remind people of that fact. Then I looked toward the bride's side, where my own meager family was scattered among Claire's college friends and former coworkers. My sister Janet, who'd driven up from Philadelphia in her ancient minivan. My cousin Steve, who'd taken time off from his job at the post office. Good people, honest people, but not the kind of people who belonged in Andrew Mitchell's world. Where exactly did you have in mind? I heard myself ask. Andrew's smile brightened, as if he was relieved I wasn't making a scene. There's some nice seats in the back section. Good view of everything, but out of the way. I think you'll find them quite comfortable. He was talking to me like I was a child who needed to be managed, and the worst part was that familiar voice in my head, the one that had been whispering for months, was telling me he was probably right. What business did a guy like me have sitting in the front row at a place like this? But then I thought about Claire, about the little girl who used to fall asleep in my arms while I read her bedtime stories. The same little girl who'd cried when kids at school made fun of her thrift store clothes, and who I'd promised would have everything she ever wanted someday. I see, I said quietly. Great. I knew you'd understand. Andrew finally released my arm and clapped me on the shoulder like we were old buddies. You're a good man, Peterson. Claire's lucky to have such a practical father. As he walked away, that knot in my stomach exploded into something hot and sharp. Not just anger, I'd dealt with plenty of that over the years. This was something else. Something that made my hands steady and my mind crystal clear for the first time in months. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a number I hadn't called in weeks. My finger hovered over it for just a moment before I pressed dial. Peterson here, I said quietly when the voice answered. We need to talk. I didn't storm out. I didn't make a scene. I simply walked toward the exit with the same measured pace I'd used in boardrooms for the past 15 years, my phone already buzzing with incoming calls. Mr. Peterson? The first voice belonged to Margaret Chin, my event coordinator. I'd worked with her on dozens of high-profile occasions, though she only knew me by the alias I'd been using for this particular project. I just got your message. Are you sure about this? The ceremony starts in 20 minutes. I stepped out into the September afternoon, where the ocean breeze carried the salt smell of the nearby shore. A line of gleaming cars stretched down the circular driveway, Maseratis, Jaguars, even a vintage Rolls-Royce that probably belonged to Andrew's grandfather. Each one worth more than most people made in a year. I'm sure, I said, walking past a fountain where carved dolphins spat crystal-clear water into a marble basin. Freeze all payments immediately. Every vendor, every service provider. I want everything stopped. But sir, the catering alone is... Margaret. My voice carried the same quiet authority I'd used in corporate conference calls from Tokyo to London. I'm not asking for your opinion. I'm giving you an instruction. Execute it. Now. There was a pause, then the rapid clicking of computer keys. It's done. All payments suspended as of now. Should I give them your contact information when they call? No. Let them figure it out themselves. The second call was to David Reeves at Manhattan Trust, my private banker for the past 8 years. David was the kind of man who handled 9-figure transactions with the same calm efficiency most people use to order coffee. Tom? What can I do for you? I'd been Thomas Peterson, the consultant to everyone here, but to David, I was simply Tom, a valued client whose wire transfers had helped fund everything from art galleries to political campaigns. I need you to stop payment on all checks issued under the Whitney Foundation account for the past 6 weeks. Everything related to the Grandview Manor event. The wedding? David's voice was carefully neutral. May I ask why? Personal reasons. How long will it take? Give me 10 minutes. The checks haven't cleared yet, so we can halt them before they hit the vendors' accounts. Tom, is everything all right? This is a substantial amount of money we're talking about. I looked back at the manor, where guests were still arriving, oblivious to the financial earthquake I'd just triggered. Through the tall windows, I could see Andrew glad handing his way through the crowd, his chest puffed out like a rooster in his perfect tuxedo. Everything's fine, David. Just handle it. The third call was the hardest one. Peterson Holdings, this is Susan. Susan Rodriguez had been my executive assistant for 5 years, and she was probably the only person who knew the full scope of what I'd built from nothing. When I'd started out with a single taxi medallion in Brooklyn 30 years ago, working 16-hour days just to keep food on the table for Claire and her mother, Susan had been there through every expansion, every acquisition, every late-night crisis. Susan, it's Tom. I need you to contact Grandview Manor directly. Tell them there's been a problem with the payment processing for today's event. The wedding? Susan's voice was sharp with concern. Tom, what happened? I closed my eyes for a moment, remembering the look on Andrew's face when he told me I wasn't good enough to sit near my own daughter. The casual dismissal, the assumption that I was nobody worth considering. The groom decided I wasn't important enough to sit in the front row. He doesn't know that the anonymous benefactor who's been funding this entire wedding is the same man he just humiliated. Oh, Tom. Susan's voice softened. How much are we talking about? Catering for 300 guests, floral arrangements, the string quartet, transportation, photography, videography, the rehearsal dinner last night, even the bridal suite at the plaza. Everything Claire dreamed of for her perfect day. And now? Now they're about to find out what happens when you bite the hand that feeds you. Even as I said it, I could see the first signs of trouble beginning. A man in a black suit, probably the manor's event manager, was hurrying across the parking lot toward the service entrance, his phone pressed to his ear. His face had the pinched look of someone receiving very bad news. Susan, I want you to transfer the Grandview account to my personal oversight, effective immediately. And call legal. I have a feeling we're going to need them. Already on it. Tom, what about Claire? That was the question I'd been avoiding. My daughter, who'd been planning this wedding for 8 months, who'd spent hours poring over fabric samples and flower arrangements, who'd been so happy she practically glowed whenever she talked about her big day. She'll understand eventually, I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. This isn't about her. It's about the man she's marrying and the family she's marrying into. The vendors are going to start calling any minute, Susan warned. The catering company alone has 40 staff on site. The floral arrangements came from 3 different suppliers. The musicians drove in from the city this morning. Let them call Andrew's family. They wanted to talk about status and important people. Let's see how important they really are. I ended the call and walked back toward my car, passing the valet who looked confused to see someone leaving before the ceremony even started. In the distance, I could hear the faint sound of the string quartet tuning their instruments, preparing to play the processional that would bring my daughter down the aisle. But something was wrong. The music stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of urgent voices. Through the manor's open doors, I caught a glimpse of people in black uniforms, caterers, probably, clustered around someone gesturing frantically. My phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. Catering company says their payment was declined. They're refusing to serve lunch. What should I tell them? I typed back. Tell them to call the father of the groom. Then I sat in my Honda Civic and waited for the chaos to begin. I couldn't stay away. Call it morbid curiosity or fatherly concern, but 15 minutes later, I found myself walking back through those ornate doors, slipping into the very back row that Andrew had so graciously suggested for me. The ceremony was supposed to start at 4 p.m. It was now 4:20, and the growing murmur of confused voices filled the hall like rising floodwater. I watched Andrew standing at the altar, his perfect composure beginning to crack around the edges. He kept glancing toward the back of the room, where a small crowd of people in black uniforms had gathered near the service entrance. "Ladies and gentlemen," the minister began, his voice carrying that practiced calm of someone who'd officiated hundreds of weddings. "We're experiencing a slight delay." He was interrupted by a man in a chef's coat who marched down the side aisle with the determination of someone who'd reached his braking limit. The chef's face was red, his white uniform spotted with what looked like sauce stains, and he was carrying a clipboard like a weapon. "Excuse me," the chef called out, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "I need to speak with whoever's responsible for payment. Our credit card was just declined, and my staff needs to know if we're serving dinner or packing up our trucks." A horrified silence fell over the crowd. I watched Andrew's father, Richard Mitchell, rise from his front row seat like a king addressing his subjects. His tuxedo was immaculate, his silver hair perfectly styled, and his expression radiated the kind of confidence that came from never having a credit card declined in his entire life. "There must be some mistake," Richard announced, his voice carrying across the hall. "I'll handle this personally." But as Richard approached the chef, more black uniformed staff began appearing. The florist, a thin woman with dirt under her fingernails, emerged from behind a massive arrangement of white orchids. Two men in matching polo shirts, probably the photography team, stepped out from behind their equipment. Even the musicians set down their instruments and began whispering urgently among themselves. "This is highly irregular," I heard Andrew's mother, Patricia, hiss to the woman sitting next to her. Patricia Mitchell was the kind of woman who never worked a day in her life but somehow believed that entitled her to treat service workers like furniture. "Richard, do something about this immediately." From my seat in the back, I had a perfect view of the developing disaster. The guests in the expensive seats were starting to shift uncomfortably, their champagne glasses forgotten as they strained to hear what was happening. Designer dresses rustled as women leaned forward to catch whispered conversations. Men in $1,000 suits checked their Rolexes and began murmuring about dinner reservations. Andrew, meanwhile, looked like he was about to be sick. His face had gone from its usual confident tan to an alarming shade of gray-green. He kept tugging at his bow tie as if it was strangling him. "Claire," he said, reaching for my daughter's hand, "maybe we should postpone." "Postpone?" Claire's voice carried a note I'd never heard before, sharp, almost shrill. She looked stunning in her grandmother's dress, the one I'd spent months having altered by the best seamstress in Queens, but her face was flushed with embarrassment. "Andrew, what is going on?" Before he could answer, the chef raised his voice again. "Look, I've got 40 people in that kitchen who need to be paid whether we serve food or not. We've got prime rib for 300 people, champagne that costs more per bottle than most people make in a day, and a wedding cake that took my pastry chef 3 days to build. Someone needs to tell me right now, are we working, or are we leaving?" That's when Richard Mitchell made his first mistake. Instead of taking the chef aside privately, he decided to assert his authority in front of everyone. "Young man," Richard announced, his voice dripping with the kind of condescension that made my teeth ache. "I don't know who you think you're dealing with, but the Mitchell family has never had a problem with payment in our entire history. Whatever clerical error has occurred, I assure you it will be resolved immediately." The chef, whose name tag read Louise, wasn't impressed. "Sir, with all due respect, my company requires payment before service. That was in our contract. The check your family gave us bounced 20 minutes ago, and our credit card authorization was declined. I've got suppliers calling me asking about their money." A gasp rippled through the crowd. I watched faces change as the reality of the situation began to sink in. These were people who lived in a world where money problems happened to other people, poor people, careless people, certainly not people like the Mitchells. "That's impossible," Patricia Mitchell declared, rising from her seat with the indignation of someone who never heard the word no in her adult life. "Richard, call the bank immediately." But Richard was already on his phone, his voice low and urgent. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but I could see the confusion spreading across his face like spilled wine on white fabric. Andrew grabbed my daughter's arm. Claire, we need to talk. Privately. No, Claire said, and there was steel in her voice that reminded me of her mother. Whatever's happening, we're handling it together. In front of everyone. That's when the florist spoke up. I hate to interrupt, but I need to know if you're keeping the arrangements. My crew is waiting outside, and we've got another wedding across town at 6. If payment doesn't go through in the next 10 minutes, we'll need to start packing up. The photographers nodded in agreement. Same here. We've got equipment to move. Even the musicians were packing their instruments. The violinist, an elderly man with kind eyes, approached the altar apologetically. I'm sorry, but our contract specifies payment on delivery of service. I watched Andrew's perfect world crumble in real time. His groomsmen, college buddies who'd probably never questioned where their trust funds came from, stood frozen like deer in headlights. His best man, a guy named Chad who drove a Ferrari and wore designer suits to casual dinners, kept looking around as if expecting someone to fix everything with a snap of their fingers. But the most painful part was watching Claire. My daughter, who dreamed of this day since she was 5 years old, stood at that altar watching her fairy tale dissolve into chaos. The confusion in her eyes was breaking my heart, but I knew this was necessary. She needed to see who she was really marrying. Andrew, she said quietly, where's my father? And that's when Andrew made his second mistake. Your father? He laughed, actually laughed, a sound bitter and desperate. Claire, your father's nobody. He's sitting in the back where he belongs. This isn't his fault because he couldn't cause this kind of problem if he tried. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Louise the chef looked uncomfortable. Claire turned slowly, scanning the crowd until her eyes found mine. For a moment, we just looked at each other across that vast, ornate room. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but there was something else there too. A question. And maybe, just maybe, the beginning of understanding. By 10 o'clock that evening, I was sitting in my real office, not the modest consulting space Andrew thought I worked from, but the corner suite on the 42nd floor of the Chrysler Building. The city spread out below me like a glittering circuit board, each light representing dreams, ambitions, and the kind of power that Andrew Mitchell couldn't even imagine. The wedding had ended in complete disaster. After 2 hours of frantic phone calls, unpaid vendors, and increasingly agitated guests, the Mitchells had been forced to announce that the reception was cancelled. I'd watched from my back row seat as Claire, still in her wedding dress, stood frozen at the altar while chaos swirled around her. The ceremony itself had been completed, barely, but there was no celebration afterward, no first dance, no cake cutting. Just 300 confused guests filing out into the September evening, whispering among themselves about the Mitchell family's sudden and very public financial embarrassment. I'd left before the final humiliation, driving back to Manhattan while my phone buzzed with updates from Susan and Margaret. But now, in the quiet of my office, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what I'd done. Mr. Peterson? I turned from the window to find Raj Patel, my chief financial officer, standing in the doorway. Raj was a brilliant man who turned down offers from Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan to work with me, and in the 12 years we'd been together, he'd never once questioned my decisions. Until tonight. Raj. I was wondering when you'd show up. He stepped into the office, closing the door behind him. At 62, Raj had the kind of calm dignity that came from growing up with nothing and building everything through careful planning and relentless work. His father had been a taxi driver in Delhi. Raj now managed a portfolio worth more than most small countries' GDP. I've been reviewing the accounts, he said, settling into the leather chair across from my desk. The wedding expenses, the Mitchell investments, all of it. Tom, what happened today? I told him everything. About Andrew's dismissal, about being relegated to the back of the room, about the casual cruelty of being deemed unworthy to sit beside my own daughter. Raj listened without interruption, his dark eyes thoughtful. The boy doesn't know who you are, Raj said finally. No. To him, I'm just some working-class guy from Queens who got lucky enough to father his beautiful bride. Raj was quiet for a moment, then pulled out his tablet. Shall we review Mr. Mitchell's situation? He swiped to a financial summary that made my stomach clench. Andrew Mitchell, 28 years old, MBA from Wharton, founder and CEO of TechFlow Solutions, a promising startup that developed logistics software for mid-sized companies. On paper, Andrew looked like a golden boy. Young, educated, ambitious, with a company valued at $12 million and growing. What Andrew didn't know, what nobody knew except Raj, myself, and our legal team, was that TechFlow's mysterious angel investor wasn't some Silicon Valley venture capitalist or tech billionaire. It was me, Thomas Peterson, the supposedly small-time consultant who wasn't important enough to sit in the front row at his own daughter's wedding. We've invested $2.8 million over the past 18 months. Raj continued, scrolling through the records. Without that funding, his company would have folded after 6 months. His fancy office in Soho, his 12 employees, his development team, all of it exists because of Peterson Holdings. I'd started investing in Andrew's company long before he'd proposed to Claire. Not because I believed in him, though his software was actually quite good, but because I wanted to understand the man my daughter was falling in love with. I'd learned long ago that you could discover more about someone's character by watching how they handled money and power than you ever could over dinner. Andrew had failed that test spectacularly. The moment he'd received the first round of funding, he'd started throwing money around like confetti. A BMW he couldn't afford, an apartment in Tribeca that cost more per month than most people made in a year, dinners at restaurants where a single bottle of wine cost more than my Honda Civic. He'd taken Claire on vacation to Paris, Aspen, the Maldives, all funded by my money, though he'd strutted around like a peacock taking credit for his success. The latest payment was due yesterday, Raj said quietly. Payroll, office rent, equipment leases, even his personal expenses, it all depends on our continued investment. Without it, he loses everything. Raj nodded. The company has enough cash flow to survive maybe 2 weeks. 3, if he cuts salaries and fires half his staff. I thought about Andrew's face when he'd grabbed my arm this afternoon, the casual dismissal in his voice when he'd suggested I sit in the back. The assumption that I was nobody, that my feelings didn't matter, that my relationship with my daughter was less important than maintaining the right atmosphere for his parents' friends. What would you recommend? I asked. Raj smiled, a rare expression that transformed his usually serious face. You know what I'd recommend. The question is whether you're prepared to follow through. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to Andrew's contact information. He'd given me his card at that first family dinner, back when he was still pretending to be interested in getting to know Claire's family. The card was thick, expensive stock with embossed lettering. Andrew J. Mitchell, CEO, TechFlow Solutions. Pull the funding, I said quietly. All of it? Every penny. As of right now, Peterson Holdings is no longer investing in TechFlow Solutions. Raj's fingers flew across his tablet screen. It's done. I'll have our legal team draft the withdrawal papers tonight. By Monday morning, Mr. Mitchell will discover that his angel investor has vanished. How long before he realizes what's happened? Payroll is due Friday. When those paychecks bounce, he'll figure it out pretty quickly. I stood up and walked back to the window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Andrew was probably trying to salvage what remained of his wedding day, maybe taking Claire to some expensive restaurant to apologize for the disaster. Using money that existed only because of my generosity. Raj, I said without turning around. Make sure he knows it was me. Not immediately, let him sweat for a few days first. But when the time is right, I want him to understand exactly who he insulted today. And if he comes to apologize? Asks for the funding back? I thought about that moment at the altar when Andrew had laughed and called me nobody. When he dismissed me in front of 300 people, including my daughter. Then we'll have a conversation, I said. A very different kind of conversation than the one we had today. My phone buzzed with a text from Claire. Dad, are you okay? I tried calling, but it went to voicemail. We need to talk. I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back. I'm fine, sweetheart. Get some rest. We'll talk tomorrow. But I knew that conversation would be the hardest one of all. 3 days later, Claire showed up at my apartment at 7 in the morning, still wearing yesterday's clothes and carrying a coffee cup that had clearly been refilled multiple times. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, her eyes were red-rimmed, and she looked like she hadn't slept in weeks. We need to talk, she said, pushing past me into the small living room where I'd raised her after her mother died. The same living room where we'd shared countless Saturday morning breakfasts, where she'd done homework at the kitchen table, where she told me about Andrew for the first time 8 months ago. Claire, honey, you look exhausted. Let me make you some. Dad? Her voice stopped me cold. It wasn't the voice of my little girl asking for help with her math homework. This was the voice of a woman who'd discovered something terrible, and was trying to piece together a puzzle she didn't want to solve. I've been talking to people. Wedding vendors, staff at the manor, even some of the guests who stayed around after everything fell apart. I sat down heavily on the couch, the same one we'd bought at a thrift store 12 years ago. What did they tell you? Claire began pacing, her sneakers squeaking on the hardwood floor. Luis, the chef from Saturday, he said the checks bounced, but that wasn't the strangest part. He said the payment authorization came from something called the Whitney Foundation, and when his company tried to trace it, they hit a wall of legal paperwork and shell companies. My stomach clenched. The Whitney Foundation was one of several charitable entities I used for anonymous donations and investments. Named after Claire's middle name, Whitney, after her mother. I'd been using it for years to fund everything from children's hospitals to scholarship programs, always staying in the shadows. Then I talked to Margaret Chin, the event coordinator. Claire continued, still pacing. Dad, she knew details about my wedding that I never told anyone except you. She knew I wanted white orchids instead of roses because of Mom's garden. She knew I wanted the musicians to play that old jazz standard you used to hum when I was little. How would some random wedding planner know those things? I couldn't meet her eyes. Claire. And the strangest thing of all, she interrupted, her voice growing stronger, is that nobody, not the caterers, not the florists, not anyone, seemed surprised that the person canceling everything was named Peterson. They kept saying things like Mr. Peterson's instructions and Mr. Peterson's account. Dad, why would wedding vendors I've never met know your name? She stopped pacing and stood in front of me, her arms crossed. In that moment, she looked exactly like her mother had 20 years ago, when she discovered I'd been secretly paying for her sister's medical bills. You paid for everything, Claire said quietly. The whole wedding. Everything Andrew and his family thought they were funding, it was you. I nodded slowly. Yes. How much? Claire, that's not. How much, Dad? Her voice cracked slightly. Because I've been doing math in my head for 3 days, and a wedding at Grandview Manor, with catering for 300 people, with those flowers, with that music, with everything we talked about, Dad, that had to cost more than you make in 5 years. More than you make in 10 years. I stood up and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the small garden where her mother used to grow vegetables. The same garden where 5-year-old Claire had helped plant tomatoes and learn that good things took time to grow. Closer to 15 years, I said quietly. If I was actually just a small-time consultant. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. When I finally turned around, Claire was sitting on the edge of the couch, staring at her hands. Who are you? She whispered. I'm your father. That's never changed. But the consulting business, this apartment, the old car. All real. This apartment is real because it's where I raised you, where we were happy. The car is real because I don't need to impress anyone with what I drive. The consulting business exists, it's just not the only thing I do. Claire looked up at me with eyes that were suddenly much older than her 26 years. What else do you do? I sat back down across from her, leaning forward with my elbows on my knees. I invest in companies. I own properties. I've been building something for 30 years, ever since your mother got sick and I realized that good intentions don't pay for cancer treatments. The taxi medallion, she said suddenly. You told me you sold Grandpa's taxi medallion to pay for Mom's treatments. That was just the beginning. I used that money to buy another medallion, then another. Then I started buying small apartment buildings, then bigger ones. I learned about technology companies, about startups, about what makes businesses succeed or fail. Claire's face was pale. How much money are we talking about, Dad? Enough that you'll never have to worry about anything. Enough that your children won't have to worry. Enough that I could pay for a wedding at Grandview Manor the same way most people pay for coffee. She was quiet for a long time, processing. Then, and Andrew doesn't know. Andrew thinks I'm nobody. He thinks I'm a burden you have to carry, an embarrassment you have to manage. Is that why you? She trailed off, but I knew what she was asking. I canceled the payments because your fiancé decided I wasn't good enough to sit beside my daughter at her wedding. Because he looked at me and saw someone beneath his notice. Someone who didn't matter. Claire's eyes filled with tears. Dad, I'm so sorry. I had no idea he said those things to you. If I had known. What would you have done? I asked gently. Would you have defended me? Or would you have been embarrassed that your working-class father was making a scene at your fancy wedding? The question hung in the air between us. Claire opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again. Her silence told me everything I needed to know. I've been watching you change over the past year, I continued. Watching you become someone who cares about the right restaurants, the right neighborhood, the right kind of people. Someone who apologizes for where she came from. That's not true. Isn't it? When's the last time you came here for dinner? When's the last time we went to Tony's Deli like we used to? When's the last time you introduced me to your friends without explaining that I'm just a consultant? Claire buried her face in her hands. Oh God, Dad! What have I done? 2 weeks after the wedding disaster, Andrew's carefully constructed world began falling apart piece by piece, like a house of cards in a hurricane. It started on a Thursday morning. I was in my office reviewing quarterly reports when Susan knocked on my door, carrying her tablet, and wearing the kind of expression that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. TechFlow's payroll bounced, she announced, settling into the chair across from my desk. All of it. 12 employees, plus Andrew's own salary. The bank called it a funding shortfall. I set down my coffee and leaned back in my chair. How long did it take him to figure out what happened? About 6 hours. He spent the morning calling every venture capital firm in the city, trying to figure out who was supposed to be funding him. Then he called his bank, then his lawyer, then his accountant. Susan scrolled through her notes. By 2 o'clock, he was in full panic mode. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office, I could see the building where TechFlow had their headquarters, a converted warehouse in Soho that Andrew had chosen because it looked entrepreneurial and innovative. I'd been the one paying for that trendy space, along with the exposed brick walls, the ping-pong table, and the espresso machine that cost more than most people's monthly rent. What about his employees? I asked. That's where it gets interesting. Susan pulled up another screen. His head developer, Maria Santos, is good. Really good. She's been carrying that company's technical development for the past year while Andrew played CEO. When the paychecks bounced, she started making calls. To other companies? To us. I raised an eyebrow. She called Peterson Holdings? She called everyone in tech who might be hiring. Turns out your reputation in the industry is better than you think. She heard through the grapevine that you sometimes invest in promising startups, and she wanted to know if you'd be interested in hiring TechFlow's development team. The irony was almost too perfect. Andrew's best employee was unknowingly asking me, the same man he'd dismissed as unworthy of sitting in the front row, to save her from the disaster I'd created by withdrawing my support. Schedule a meeting with her, I said. But not here. Somewhere neutral. I want to hear what she has to say. Already done. She's meeting you at the Starbucks on Madison Avenue tomorrow at 10. She doesn't know who she's meeting with. I told her to look for someone in a blue suit carrying the Wall Street Journal. I spent that evening researching Maria Santos more thoroughly. 32 years old, MIT graduate, 3 patents in logistics software, and according to her LinkedIn profile, criminally underpaid by Andrew's company. She'd been the real brains behind TechFlow's success, while Andrew took credit and collected investor money. The next morning, I sat in the corner booth of the Starbucks, watching Maria pace outside the window. She was small and intense, wearing jeans and a TechFlow hoodie, carrying a laptop bag that looked like it had seen better days. When she finally came inside and approached my table, her handshake was firm and her eyes were sharp with intelligence. "Mr. Peterson?" she said. "Thank you for meeting with me. I know this is unusual." "Not at all. Please sit. Can I buy you a coffee?" "I'm good, thanks. I've probably had too much caffeine already this week." She sat down across from me and opened her laptop. "I'll be honest with you, Mr. Peterson. I don't know much about your company, but I've heard you're someone who recognizes talent and isn't afraid to invest in good ideas. Tell me about TechFlow," I said, though I probably knew more about the company's finances than she did. Maria's face tightened. "It's a mess. Andrew, our CEO, he's brilliant at marketing himself, but he doesn't understand the first thing about running a business. We've got great software, solid contracts with mid-sized companies, and a development team that could revolutionize logistics management. But somehow, we can't make payroll. What do you think went wrong?" "Money management. Andrew spends like we're already profitable, but we're not. He's got expensive tastes and no understanding of cash flow. Plus, whoever our investor was, they've disappeared. Andrew won't tell us who was funding the company, just that they're restructuring their portfolio." I sipped my coffee and watched her carefully. "What would you do differently?" "Cut the overhead immediately. Move out of that expensive office, get rid of the fancy furniture, focus on product development and customer service. We could be profitable within 6 months if someone made smart decisions instead of impressive ones." "And your team? Would they follow you if you left TechFlow?" Maria smiled for the first time since sitting down. "Mr. Peterson, my team has been following me for months. Andrew signs the paychecks, when they don't bounce, but I'm the one keeping that company running. What if I told you I might be interested in hiring all of you? Not just you, but your entire development team." Her eyes widened. "Are you serious?" "Very. I've been looking to expand into logistics software. But I need people who understand the market, who have experience with real clients and real problems." "What about Andrew?" "What about him?" "Well, he owns the company. The patents, the client contracts, everything." I leaned forward slightly. "Ms. Santos, let me ask you something. If a company can't make payroll, can't pay rent, and can't honor its contracts, what is it really worth?" She stared at me for a long moment, then slowly started to smile. "You want to buy TechFlow. I want to buy TechFlow's assets when it goes under. Which, based on what you're telling me, should be sometime next week. And Andrew? Andrew can go back to whatever he was doing before he decided to play entrepreneur with other people's money." Maria closed her laptop and extended her hand. "Mr. Peterson, I think we're going to work very well together." After she left, I called Raj to set the acquisition in motion. By the time Andrew realized what was happening, TechFlow would be nothing more than a name on some worthless incorporation papers. His employees would be working for me, his clients would be my clients, and his dreams of being a tech mogul would be as dead as his ability to make payroll. It wasn't enough that he'd lost the wedding. I wanted him to lose everything he'd built on my money, everything he'd used to impress my daughter, everything he thought made him better than a small-time consultant from Queens. Andrew Mitchell was about to discover that actions have consequences, and insulting the wrong person could cost you everything you thought you owned. Andrew arrived at my office on a gray Tuesday morning in October, exactly 3 weeks after his wedding should have been the happiest day of his life. Susan had called ahead to warn me he was coming, describing him as desperate, angry, and possibly unhinged. Through my office windows, I watched him emerge from a taxi, not the BMW he used to drive, which had apparently been repossessed 2 days earlier. He looked like hell. His designer suit was wrinkled, his usually perfect hair was disheveled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping much. When Susan escorted him into my office, his hands were shaking slightly, and I could smell the stale coffee and desperation on him. "Mr. Peterson," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "We need to talk. Please sit down." I gestured to the chair across from my desk, the same one where Raj and I had planned his destruction 3 weeks ago. "Can I offer you something to drink? Coffee? Water?" "I don't want your hospitality," Andrew snapped, but he sat down anyway, his legs seeming unsteady. "I want answers." I leaned back in my leather chair and studied him calmly. Gone was the arrogant young man who'd grabbed my arm at the wedding and told me where I belong. This was someone who'd had his world systematically dismantled and was just beginning to understand how completely he'd been outmaneuvered. "What kind of answers?" "You know damn well what kind." Andrew's voice cracked slightly. "Tech flow. The funding that disappeared overnight. The wedding payments. All of it. It was you, wasn't it?" I picked up a pen from my desk and turned it over in my hands, letting the silence stretch between us. Outside, the sounds of Manhattan traffic drifted up from 42 floors below, horns honking, sirens wailing, the constant hum of a city that never stopped moving. A city where fortunes were made and lost every single day. "Yes," I said finally. "It was me." The admission hit him like a physical blow. He actually rocked back in his chair, his face going pale. "Jesus Christ. You funded everything. The company, the wedding, everything." "Everything," I confirmed. "Your office rent in Soho, your employees' salaries, your fancy equipment, even that BMW you've been driving around town. All of it came from Peterson Holdings. But you're—" he struggled to find the words. "You're nobody. You're just some small-time consultant from Queens. How could you possibly have hundreds of millions of dollars?" I finished. "Is that what you're trying to ask?" Andrew's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "Hundreds of millions? The Whitney Foundation, which funded your wedding, is worth about 40 million. Peterson Holdings, my primary company, manages a portfolio worth considerably more. I own commercial real estate in Manhattan, residential properties in Brooklyn and Queens, equity stakes in 17 different companies, and enough liquid assets to buy your entire social circle twice over." I stood up and walked to the windows, looking out at the city where I'd built my empire one careful decision at a time. 30 years ago, I was driving a taxi in Brooklyn, working 18-hour days to pay for my wife's cancer treatments. When she died, I had a choice: feel sorry for myself, or make sure my daughter never had to worry about money the way I did. "So you, what? Got lucky with some investments?" I turned back to face him. "I got smart. I studied every deal, learned from every mistake, and built something that would last. While you were at Wharton learning theories about business, I was actually running businesses. While you were networking at cocktail parties, I was working with people like Maria Santos, people who create real value instead of just talking about it." Andrew's face flushed red. "Maria? What does she have to do with this?" "She works for me now. Along with your entire development team. They start Monday at Peterson Holdings Technology Division." I sat back down and met his eyes directly. "They're brilliant people, Andrew. They deserve better than working for someone who spent their investment money on toys and status symbols." "You can't do this," Andrew said, his voice rising. "I'll sue. You'll what?" My voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath it. "Sue me with what money? With which lawyers? Andrew, you don't own anything anymore. Your company is bankrupt, your assets are gone, and your reputation in the tech industry is finished." He stared at me in silence, the full scope of his situation finally sinking in. When he spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. "Why? Why would you do this to me?" I leaned forward, my hands folded on the desk. Do you remember what you said to me at the wedding? When you told me I couldn't sit in the front row? I was just trying to manage the seating arrangements. My parents had expectations. You told me to sit in the back because I wasn't important enough to sit near my own daughter. You looked at me and decided I was nobody, that my feelings didn't matter, that I was an embarrassment to be managed. But I didn't know. You didn't know who I was, I interrupted. And that's exactly the problem. You judged me based on my clothes, my car, my address. You assumed that because I didn't flaunt my wealth, I didn't have any. You treated me like I was beneath your notice. Andrew's hands were shaking more noticeably now. I made a mistake. I'm sorry. I was nervous about the wedding, and my parents were putting pressure on me. Your apology is noted, I said quietly. But it doesn't change what you revealed about yourself. You showed me that you're the kind of man who judges people by their bank accounts, who treats others as less than human if they don't meet your standards of success. Please, Andrew said, and there were tears in his eyes now. I'll do anything. I'll make it up to you, to Claire. Just give me another chance. I stood up and walked to the door, opening it for him. Andrew, I want you to remember something. Wealth doesn't make a man. Character does. Integrity does. The way you treat people when you think they can help you, that's who you really are. He stumbled to his feet, looking lost and broken. What am I supposed to do now? You're young, you're educated, and despite everything, you're not without talent. Figure out who you want to be when you don't have other people's money to hide behind. As Andrew walked toward the door, I added one final thought. And Andrew? Stay away from my daughter. She deserves better than someone who judges her father by the car he drives. After he left, I sat alone in my office for a long time, watching the sun set over the city. I felt no satisfaction in his destruction, no joy in his tears. What I felt was something deeper, the quiet certainty that I'd protected my daughter from making the biggest mistake of her life. Sometimes being a father meant making the hard choices, even when they broke your own heart. Claire came home on a Thursday evening in November, 6 weeks after what should have been her wedding day. I was in the kitchen of my queen's apartment, making the same spaghetti and meatballs I'd cooked for her every Thursday when she was growing up, back when she was just my little girl and not someone trying to escape where she came from. I heard her key in the lock, then her footsteps in the hallway. When she appeared in the kitchen doorway, I almost didn't recognize her. Gone were the designer clothes and perfectly styled hair. She was wearing jeans with holes in the knees, an old Columbia University sweatshirt I'd bought her for Christmas 3 years ago, and her hair was pulled back in the same simple ponytail she'd worn in high school. But it was her eyes that told the real story. They were red from crying, but there was something else there too, something I hadn't seen in months. Peace, maybe? Or relief. Hi, Dad, she said quietly. Hi, sweetheart. I turned off the stove and faced her. Are you hungry? I made too much food as usual. She smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her since before she'd gotten engaged. I'd love some. But first, we need to talk. We sat at the same kitchen table where she'd done her homework, where we'd shared countless meals, where I'd taught her to play chess and helped her practice for spelling bees. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, illuminating the photographs on the refrigerator, pictures of Claire at various ages, always smiling, always happy in this modest apartment that Andrew Mitchell had thought was beneath his notice. I broke up with Andrew, she said without preamble. 3 days ago. It's over. I nodded, though I wasn't surprised. Susan had mentioned seeing Claire's engagement announcement disappear from the newspaper's social pages, and Andrew hadn't been seen around the city since his visit to my office. How are you feeling about that? Claire was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her hands. Like I've been sleepwalking for the past year and just woke up. Dad, I need to apologize to you. For so many things. Claire. No, let me finish. She looked up at me, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I became someone I don't recognize. Someone who was embarrassed by her father, by where she came from, by the fact that we shopped at thrift stores and drove old cars and lived in Queens instead of Manhattan. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture that reminded me of the little girl who used to cry when kids at school made fun of her second-hand clothes. Andrew made me feel like I had to choose between him and you, between his world and our world. And for a while, I thought his world was better. Fancier restaurants, expensive vacations, people with money and influence. I thought that was what success looked like. What changed your mind? You did. She smiled through her tears. When everything fell apart at the wedding, when I started putting the pieces together about who you really are, I realized that Andrew never loved me for who I was. He loved the idea of me, the pretty girl who could be shaped into whatever he needed for his image. Claire reached across the table and took my hand. But you've loved me exactly as I am from the day I was born. When Mom was sick and we had no money, you worked 3 jobs to keep me in dance classes because you knew it made me happy. When I wanted to go to Columbia but we couldn't afford it, you somehow made it happen. When I got my heart broken in college, you drove 4 hours through a snowstorm just to bring me ice cream and tissues. That's what fathers do, I said quietly. No, she shook her head. That's what good fathers do. That's what fathers who love their children more than their own pride do. And instead of being grateful, instead of being proud of the man who raised me, I spent a year trying to hide you from my new life. She was crying openly now, but she didn't let go of my hand. Andrew told me what happened when he came to see you. About your company, about the money, about everything. He was furious that you'd tricked him, that you'd let him think you were nobody important. But Dad, you didn't trick anyone. You've been showing everyone exactly who you are for 30 years. You're a man who works hard, who keeps his word, who takes care of the people he loves. I squeezed her hand gently. And you're my daughter. That's all that's ever mattered to me. I know that now. But I almost threw it all away for someone who thought I should be ashamed of you. She wiped her eyes again. When I was little, you used to tell me that you were proud of me. Do you remember? Every day. Well, I want you to know that I'm proud of you. Not because you're wealthy, though I'm still getting used to that idea, but because you're good. Because you built something meaningful from nothing. Because you never forgot where you came from, even when you could afford to. Claire stood up and walked around the table, wrapping her arms around me the way she used to when she was small and the world seemed too big and scary. I'm sorry, Dad. For being ashamed of you, for choosing someone else's opinion over yours, for almost walking away from the best thing in my life because I thought I deserved something fancier. I held my daughter close, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo, feeling the weight of the past year's worry finally lifting from my shoulders. You have nothing to apologize for, I whispered. You were finding your way, figuring out who you wanted to be. That's what growing up is. And now I know who I want to be, she said, pulling back to look at me. I want to be someone you can be proud of. Someone who doesn't forget where she came from or who helped her get there. As we sat down to eat our simple dinner in our modest kitchen, Claire told me about her plans. She'd left her job at the marketing firm. Andrew had gotten it for her through his connections, and was going back to her original dream of teaching. She'd moved out of the expensive apartment in Tribeca and found a small place in Brooklyn, not far from where I'd driven that first taxi 30 years ago. I want to earn my own way, she explained between bites of spaghetti. I want to know that what I have, I earned honestly. Looking at my daughter, really looking at her for the first time in months, I saw not the confused young woman who'd been trying to transform herself into someone else, but the strong, principled person I'd always known she could become. As for Andrew, we never spoke of him again. He'd faded from our lives as completely as if he'd never existed, leaving behind only the valuable lesson that sometimes you have to lose everything to find out who you really are. And me? I went back to being what I'd always been, not just a successful businessman, but a father who loved his daughter unconditionally, and a daughter who finally understood that was more valuable than all the money in the world.